Hello everybody, welcome back to LumeKeebs. Today we are going to talk about two new switches. It is the Wuque Morandi, which is the one in white. It's an interesting name, Morandi, I hope I pronounced it correctly. The other is the Durock Black Lotus, a very much more interesting and unique name, and it does kind of look like a Black Lotus, I guess. Both of these switches are quite interesting. There are a few different design elements that makes them quite different from your normal switches, so let's dive right into it. Both of these switches have a light diffuser, and they look pretty much exactly the same, so I'm going to guess that Wuque probably outsourced this manufacturing to Durock, because the construction looks very similar. That being said, the materials they're using are very different. For the Morandi, it's a palm top, palm bottom, and a UPE stem. Whereas for the Black Lotus, it's a PC UPE blend for the top, nylon for the bottom, and a modified palm for the stem. Now, both of these do also have a long pole design, which we're going to see shortly. But let's tear this apart and take a look at it. All right, so this is Morandi. You can see it's a two-stage spring, a very long spring. Pull that out. In terms of the leaf, it's pretty standard design, nothing fancy there. Now, when we get to the top, that's when things get a little bit more interesting. You've got your light diffuser right here. So what is this thing for? All right, so usually your keyboard LEDs are somewhere around here, right? So this basically acts as a light guide, pushes the light, kind of conducts in quotation marks, acts as a light guide here and kind of makes this part right here shine in whatever color you have, right? So if you are one of those people that are really into LEDs, these designs should, in theory, make your lighting a lot more uniform. A lot of times when you have a keyboard that has LEDs, you see lights kind of either coming here or here, and you kind of shine, see more light brightness on this side than this side, and vice versa. Whereas this, in theory, would make your lighting a little bit more even, right? And so if you really like that RGB goodness, if you're a gamer, chances are this might be something you'd be interested in to check out. The other piece that's interesting on this is the long pole. So take a look at this pole right here on the stem, right? It's much longer than normal. Let me pull out the pole of a banana split to show you the difference. That's the pole of banana split versus the Morandi. So you can see the pole's much longer on the Morandi. What does that do? So let's dive right into that a little bit. So a long pole switch, if you use that on a standard housing, you end up bottoming out earlier because your pole is longer. And normal switches bottom out on the sides of the switch, of the stem, right? So this part and this part right here bottoms out on the bottom of the switch, and that's why you get a bottom out. With this Morandi design, because the pole is longer and they're using a standard housing, you're actually bottoming out on the pole instead of the sides of the stem. So what does that do? That creates a different pitch in the sound. In theory, since the contact area is smaller, you're probably going to get a slightly higher pitched sound compared to your other switches. We'll see if that's true. The other thing, obviously, you're going to have a much shorter travel distance. On the Morandi specifically, you have about 3.5 millimeters versus your standard 4. And so that means your switch is going to bottom out earlier. The feeling is also a little bit different when you bottom out a switch that is bottoming out on the bottom end of the stem versus on the stem pole. Because the contact area is much smaller, the bottoming out feeling is going to be different. And the last thing to note is because when you bottom out your switch, when you're at the bottom of the travel, the only thing touching the bottom of the housing is the pole instead of the sides of the stem. There tends to be a bit more movement once you've bottomed out compared to a traditional switch like your banana split. Because with the banana split, when you bottom out, you're touching the bottom sides of the stem, and so it is a bit more stable. It's a minor difference, but something to note regardless. Chances are this will not bother you if you're a typer, but if you're a gamer with your WSAD where you're holding that down, you might find that with a long pole design such as Morandi, you have a slightly slightly more stem wobble when you're kind of holding the button down. Next up, we have the Black Lotus. Interesting design as well. Let's pop that wide open. Note that both of these switches are quite tight. They have a pretty tight housing on both of these to help reduce your housing wobble and your stem wobble, which is nice. We like to see that. It does make them a little bit harder to open. Interestingly, the diffuser design is different on the Durock, right? On the top end, it looks very similar on top, right? The design on top is very similar looking, but on the bottom, it's a very different looking shape and design. So maybe they're not the same manufacturer after all, or maybe they are. Hard to say. But this is kind of like almost like a bridge type of design. Your LED would usually be about here, so like that kind of would help capture a lot of light and push it through to the diffuser top. Also note that both of these diffusers are removable, so if you don't want them, you could take them out, and now you're back to a more kind of traditional switch design. I don't think it affects anything else, so even if you don't need the diffuser, you don't have to take it off. I don't think it makes any significant differences. The other thing to note is for the Durock, they advertise that their springs are made in Japan. Take that with what you will. Usually we find that the Durock springs are of high quality, and this spring does look to be of high quality. The Morandi's spring origins are unknown, but it's also a dual stage spring, which is a different design, which is interesting. Okay, so those are the two switches that we're going to talk about today. But let's see what they sound like. We've got the Morandi here, Black Lotus, and as a comparison point, we've got some of the more popular switches, which is the Oil King and the Banana Splits over here. Now we've got them in stock form, in lubed form, and in lube and film form. For the Banana Split and Oil Kings, we only have them in lube and film form. Now, you might ask, why we're separating between lubed and filmed? This is because the Morandi and the Black Lotus both have pretty tight housings. And so we're trying to see if it makes a difference when you film them or not, right? But as you can see over here, in the stock form, there is basically zero housing wobble. Like, you can't move them at all. It's super tight. So let's find out. We'll start off with the Morandi in the stock form. Black Lotus. Black Lotus. So on the stock form, I feel like the Morandi is like a slightly more muted version of the Black Lotus. They both have similar sound profiles, but the Morandi is slightly more muted. Comparing to the Oil King, and a Banana Split. All very similar sound profile wise. I would say the long pole switcher seems to have a slightly higher pitch to my ears compared to the Oil King and the Banana Split. Oil King being the deepest sounding, but somewhat similar in terms of sound profile. Now let's go to the lubed version when it comes to the Morandi. The pitch definitely alters, and I feel like there's a bit more clarity on the lubed version. All right, let's hear it again. All right, the pitch definitely changed, and I do think it sounds a bit more clear from the lubed version. Now to a Black Lotus. That's a huge difference right there. The Black Lotus became much more clackier to my ears. Also much more clear in terms of the pitch and the tone. That's a very drastic difference. Now let's compare between Morandi and the Black Lotus. In the looped version, the Black Lotus is definitely much higher pitched compared to the Morandi. So that's interesting. Now onto the lubed and filmed. That sounds very similar to my ears from Morandi. Let's try out the Black Lotus. I think the Black Lotus deepens the pitch slightly. It's a very minor difference, but it's a slight pitch difference. When you film it, it seems like the pitch deepens ever so slightly. Alright, but generally speaking, between these two, the lubed and the lubed and film version, very minor differences. Seems like the filming does deepen the Black Lotus slightly. For the Morandi, it feels more or less the same to me. Now in terms of stem wobble, this is a bit more subjective. First to the Black Lotus. I would say it feels very similar. I think it's a slight improvement when filmed, but it's very minor. Not to Morandi. Morandi is more of a bigger difference. It definitely improves slightly when it comes to the filming. But for Black Lotus is very tight to begin with. Right, Black Lotus has much less stem wobble compared to the Morandi. So the Black Lotus, filming it makes a very minor difference, whereas for the Morandi there is an improvement there. And I would say the Black Lotus is better than the Oil King, even filmed, and the Banana Split. The Black Lotus is very tight, very minimal stem wobble, so it feels good. Now onto the feeling, because as we mentioned before, with long pole switches, you're bottoming out on the pole instead of the stem, the sides of the stem itself. So let's see if it feels any different to me. This is going to be hard to describe, but to me, the bottoming out on the pole feels a bit sharper, right? Whereas these feel more like a thud, right? It's more like a thud where you go down and you reach the bottom and it kind of just bottoms out and it's like a thud. It's a very solid feeling. This is more of a sharper feeling, right? And as mentioned before, when you bottom it out, right? Let's say I'm holding this key down for my WSADs. There's definitely more movement for the long poles, especially on the Morandi, right? See how I'm moving this? There's more movement for the long pole guys, right? So that's something to keep in mind if that would bother you. Honestly, I don't see how it would, because you know when you're playing a shooter, your WSAD, you're not like you're not shifting around on your WSADs. If you're doing that, you're doing it wrong. So I don't think it will bother anyone, but it's just something to keep in mind. But generally, the bottoming out feeling of the long pole switches are quite satisfying, I would say. If you like a more kind of sharper kind of response when it comes to bottoming out versus more of a solid thuddy kind of feeling of the normal switches, it's definitely worth trying out. I would say just from my testing it, I originally thought that this would be more kind of gamer centric, but I would say even for typists, if you like that kind of feeling, even on our premium boards, these are very good candidates, right? In terms of feeling, I actually really like it. Even compared to top tier switches like the Oil King and the Banana Split. So it's just something else to keep in your arsenal, something different, something to try out and see if that fits your style. I personally really like it. Give it a shot and see what you think. Let us know in your comments. What do you think of long pole switches? Do you like long pole switches? What do you think of the Morandi? What do you think of the Black Lotus? Switch names are getting more and more crazy these days. How are you liking that? Wuque switches, they're pretty new to the scene, but it seems like they're doing really well. What are your thoughts? So once again, this is LumeKeebs. Check out our store at www.lumekeebs.com. We are always stocking up with the latest and greatest switches, and if we have anything that you would like to see that we don't currently have, leave us a comment below. We'd love to hear from you guys. Whatever it is, let us know in the comments, and we'll see you next time.